Crackerjack, and what a lot of fun that was. Well, now at 6:15, John Freeman is face-to-face with Adam Faith. This series marked a big change in the BBC's style of interviewing, a change which I, for one, felt was definitely for the better, in which the subject of the interview was almost continually on camera in close-up. Thus, the full range of reaction and expression and emotion was there for all to see. Adam was only 20 when the program was made, but you may feel he coped with fame rather more successfully than some of today's breed. Now at 6:15, the perennial David Jacobs introduces Jukebox Jury, the pop show of the 60s, in which the latest records were judged by a panel of impartial and occasionally extremely forthright artists. The verdicts are delivered tonight by Nina and Frederick, Jill Ireland and David McCallum. Now then, Cliff Morgan introduces 50 minutes of the late Hugh Wheldon. Sir Hugh, who died last March, had a distinguished career in BBC television. He was first a presenter, then a producer, and subsequently controller of programs, ending his career as our managing director. He was responsible for such series as Civilization, History of America, and Ascent of Man. Sir Hugh Wheldon was a fun-loving Welshman, and as you'll see during the next 3/4 of an hour, a raconteur of considerable skill.
But, however, let me just tell you a very curious incident that happened to me many years ago when I was here. I had to see some program, and I can't remember what it was, but it was some program in my office, and so I called and had this shown. And there was a little notice put by the projectionist from downstairs saying, "Please stand by at the end of the program," written on an envelope. So I saw the program, and then the program finished, and this envelope came again, "Please stand by." So I stood by. And then I saw an interview, just like you and me. I saw an interview quite clearly done from Blue Peter, because I recognized the chap who's no longer there. This is some years ago. And there was this chap from Blue Peter and this other man, and between them, standing on a table, was this bird. And it was the biggest of all the buzzard family, or biggest of all the hawk family. I think it was a long-tailed American eagle. Anyway, there it was a buzzard. And so it belonged to this chap, and there was a good deal of talk about it. And had he had it long? Yes, a year. Was it easy to look after? Oh, very simple, very good, nice bird in every possible way. Where did it actually come? Well, it came from Canada, and of course in Canada it hovered over the prairies, and it is said that it would occasionally fall upon a lamb, but he thought that it was most unlikely. Hares, perhaps, but not really lambs, he didn't think. And was he happy? Oh, very happy, and flew up and came back to lures and so on and so forth. In fact, said this chap, I thought he might be nervous. He's not actually, he's very nice here, but I thought he might be nervous, and just in case he was, I brought another of my little pets, with whom it's most touching. He's made up the most inseparable companionship. I mean, they're devoted to each other. I got here, he said, a little mouse, and he brought out this little mouse and put it on the table, and this hawk instantly picked it up and ate it. Now, it was absolutely flabbergasting. And so there was total silence while this hawk consumed its inseparable companion. Little teeth, little legs. I mean, it was a simply frightful sight, you see. It really was. I mean, I've rarely seen anything more violent in every possible. Anyway, there it was. It finished. And then I thought, well, there it is. And then it started all over again. And clearly they'd recorded it instantly, all over again. Once more, we saw the chap and had a very long prayer. Yes, I said, oh, lovely bird. Where's the really Canada? Occasionally feel. In fact, said the chap, in case he was nervous, I did bring one. I was going to bring one of his inseparable, his most touching relationship up with the little mouse I have, but unfortunately he cannot be with us today. So there you are, it takes all sorts.
Hugh Wheldon loved telling tales and breathing fire. And like the soldier in Wilfred Owen's poem, he had both mastery and mystery. You see, Hugh believed passionately that the story was important. I recall him saying many a time that when a storyteller tells a story, he can please or offend, make you laugh or make you cry, make you hope, make you despair. And he said there was nothing wrong with any of these things, for they're all part of the human experience. I think it's fair to say that his Welshness had something to do with his being an unrivaled raconteur, a tireless conversationalist of sustained intellectual energy. He also loved a challenge, and when he joined the BBC in 1952, he shared in the excitement and the wonder of the pioneering days of television, days he recalled with great delight when he spoke with Frank Gillard in 1983.
I was lucky because I joined the place, as you said, in 1952. In fact, at a time when there were growths inherent in the business anyway. Technically, the thing was going to move. And secondly, there was a generation there of people who were a post-war generation. An awful lot of them had been in the Army or the Navy or the Air Force, had been around. The reputation of the BBC was gigantic. Gigantic, because people like you, among others, during the war, the one thing that was believed was the BBC. And everybody who'd been in the Army thought, or the Navy, or the forces, thought very highly of this great operation. So we found ourselves in television in these simple days, but we were already very impressed by this great organization and by the fact that there was growth anywhere. And gradually there came into being, over the first 10 years of my time there, perhaps a little more, 12 years, what I think can be called a kind of force of all arms. Sportsview, oddly enough, was the first. Sportsview originally had been films of football matches, rugby matches, whatever they were, with somebody introducing them on a Thursday night saying this is what happened during the week. But gradually that got bigger so that you could take bits of different matches in different parts of the country. They had live things as well. They got sportsmen into the studio so that you had studio direction and film direction and outside OB direction. You had people who later became very big, Brian Cowgill, who became the managing director of Thames, Paul Fox, who became the managing director of Yorkshire, Peter Dimmock, who became a great power in his own right, like a kind of secular pope. And all these chaps worked together and they put on, week after week, Sportsview, and it was a big deal. Now, that was caught. It was somehow or other, it infected what was called in those days the talks department, which was current affairs and everything, non-fiction. Somehow this notion of a force of all arms took possession of minds there. There was a woman called Grace Wyndham Goldie. Terrific woman she was. Her heart and her mind marched together. She was a very experienced woman of affairs, married to an actor, Wyndham Goldie. She was a woman, somebody said, with a whim of iron. And she recognized what was happening in Sportsview, and she brought this into a program in those days called Panorama. And she made that into a force of all arms, so that on Monday nights you knew that in Panorama you might get an outside broadcast of something taking place somewhere, films of other things taking place elsewhere in different parts of the world, anywhere. If there were wars on in Korea, well then of course Panorama would be there. There'd be things in the studio, and if there were prime ministers, naturally it would be in Panorama that they'd be interviewed. And once more, this force of all arms was put under impressive human beings. Michael Peacock, I remember, was the first producer of Panorama. It became a kind of flagship for current affairs because it was a force of all arms in the sense that it was under command.
And being in command was nothing new for Hugh. Before he joined the BBC, he'd had a distinguished career in the Army, first of all in the Royal Welsh Fusiliers, and then for 5 years as an officer in the Royal Ulster Rifles, when he was awarded the Military Cross for bravery in battle. He was for certain a man of many parts and pluperfect at them all. He wasn't just versatile, he was unique. And on top of all this, he was a tireless endorser of good ideas. And when the BBC Talks department planned a programme to celebrate the 80th birthday of Sir Winston Churchill, Hugh was the obvious man to send to number 10 Downing Street to put the Prime Minister at his ease.
Churchill decided that he would retire, I think I'm right in saying, actually on his 80th birthday as Prime Minister. And this announcement was made many months before the birthday. And the question then arose, what sort of television programme should accompany this event? All sorts of people put up all sorts of ideas, but they all sounded like obituaries. And God knows he was old and 80, but he wasn't dead. Now, Grace Goldie She was a girl and a half. Well, a girl. She was 60 by then. But anyway, she was, Grace Goldie was a great girl. And she was running the so-called current affairs outfit of the talks department. And she came up with this very bright idea. And her idea was that she would collect about 12 or 14 of Churchill's intimates into a studio in Lime Grove in Shepherd's Bush. And they included eventually, I remember, Lord Ismay chairing it, and then Churchill's driver, and General Fleming, and Violet Bonham Carter, people from all sorts of walks of life. And she would ask them to address Churchill by way of the camera. So there's a camera in front of them, like there is in front of me now, and they would be asked to talk to this camera. Now, Churchill was asked to be in Downing Street, and we arranged this with his staff. And the theory was that he would look at this program, and he would be in a chair in Downing Street with a television set in front of him, looking at it. That was the setup, so that there would be a program of people saying things to Churchill, complimentary things on his birthday, which he would see and be in a position eventually to respond to. Now, Grace was very bothered about all this because she'd got the idea, but it was going to be difficult to do. And she asked me, although I was quite a senior man by then, and in charge of all sorts of programs, she asked me whether I'd go down to Downing Street just to make sure everything was all right down there. And so, of course, I said I would. Now, I've met Prime Minister since, and I've worked with Prime Minister since. And it so happened I saw a lot of Lloyd George when I was a boy, because of all sorts of other, but I had never, not only never met, I'd never seen Churchill, never. And so I went down to Downing Street for this event, and everything was okay there. The camera was there, ready for him to talk to if he wanted to when they'd finished. The television set was there. We had to put one in, by the way. There wasn't a television set in Downing Street. And that was there. There were ashtrays there, and a chap told me he wouldn't need them. He only puts them on to go outside. I must put a cigar on for them, he says, but he didn't smoke much. He was old. Then his family turned up. He wasn't there, but Duncan Sands and all, Randolph, alive in those days, and the girls, they all turned up. And then presently, around about 7:30, this program was going to start at 8. Around about 20 to 8, the old chap, quite suddenly, with Clemmy, his wife, came in. And I was shocked. I had no idea that he would look so old. I mean, he looked like primeval. And his skin was like parchment, leathery. And he was very, very slow. And all the children, people said, hello, Daddy, and all this kind of thing. He paid no attention to any of them, but shuffled across to one of the two chairs and sat down, and he hardly say the wrong one, but there was no question of getting him up once he was down, planked himself down there, and Clemmy planked herself next to him. And the television set was on, and the news was on, and he looked at this thing. And he said in an extremely frail, broken voice, he said, is this a program? And Clemmy said, no, Winston, this is the news. And he then said, he didn't look at me, he never addressed a word to me throughout the whole thing. He said, is this what they are doing for me? And I then said, and I saw from what Clemmy had done, that I had to address him in a kind of reverential bellow. So I said, no, sir, this is the preceding program, and at 8 o'clock they will be talking to you from Shepherd's Bush, Lord Ismay, and a group of friends will be talking to you here, sir. And he said, Ismay is in Paris. And I said, no, sir, we have brought him over to Shepherd's Bush. So he left it at that. I then said, now they will all be talking to you, sir, and I had to go on in this ridiculous bellowing voice. And when it's all finished, sir, I said, if you want to say anything back to them, you'll be able to do so. All you have to do, I'll give you a signal when they're finished, and it's just a question of turning to the camera, sir. And you can then talk to them. If you talk to the camera, they'll be able to see you. And he paid no attention, none. So I had no idea. So I nipped off, and the program by then was on the verge of starting. I rang Grace up. She was in the control gallery. Of course, it was live. Everything was live in those days. But it had to be live anyway. And she was in the control gallery in Lime Grove. And I rang her, and I said, I've no idea whether you're going to talk or not. And she was not? No idea. She said, he must talk. And I said, well, I can't. He may, but I can't tell. She was very, very cross. I said, well, cross or no, you better have the trumpet. We've got trumpets, of course, all laid on, flags and everything to finish the thing up with. And I said, we better have them laid on for a quick cue. And so she was very cross, and anyway, there it was. The program then started, and I went in and I looked at it. It was a lovely program, and Violet Bonham Carter was marvellous, and she said, we all remember you for all sorts of things, Winston, but what I remember is that you gave me courage, which I didn't know I had, only because I felt that you were giving it to me. And when he was nice when he made statements of this kind, and the others were there, and Fleming did his stuff properly, and others did their stuff properly, and the program was a good program. And in all these statements, of course, Clemmy, from time to time, his wife, had been mentioned. And whenever she was mentioned, he vaguely looked at her. But whether to suggest that he didn't think that she should have been mentioned, or to suggest how nice they mentioned you as well, it was absolutely impossible to tell. Anyway, there it was, as I say, it was a good program. And eventually I felt it coming to an end. And I started hearing Ismay say, and so, Winston, today on your 80th birthday, when you are leaving the government, we, your friends, speaking on behalf of so many others, etc., etc., etc. And I knew that they were raising champagne, and so on and so forth. And so I knew the moment had come for me to try and give him a signal in order to suggest, at least to him, remind him that he might talk back to them. And so I placed myself near the camera, and I looked at him in order to give him this signal, and it was exactly as if I had come round a little bend in a little country road and run into a lorry with headlights on, because he was glaring at me. And so I nervously made this signal. I heard Churchill say, Ismay say, and I made this signal to the camera, and then he moved his entire chair, not just himself, the entire chair, moved, and it was just as if he was switched on in some kind of curious secret switch. Life was in the old thing. And out came this enormous voice, no longer broken or fragile. I have been surprised and astounded and all this stuff, to have had these messages of affection brought to me in the sanctity of my own home, and these huge Gibbonesque paragraphs came out of him, and they were first-rate, beautifully composed, properly finished, manly, and meaningful. And there were 2 or 3 of these paragraphs which lasted 3 or 4 minutes, and on he went. And I thought, this is, wonderful. And there he was. And eventually he came to a finish, and then he turned his entire chair around, took his eyes off the camera, looked at me and said, good night. So I naturally thought, well, this is absolutely splendid. I waited until I knew I could tell that we had a monitor over there, that we'd gone back to the studio and the credits were beginning to run, and then I rushed up to him, of course, to say that was magnificent, but he'd switched off. And his family came up. Daddy, but he paid no attention to it. None at all. None whatsoever. He said in his broken-off voice to Clemmy, he said, I hadn't had time to prepare. And she said, you were very good, Winston. And he said, I hadn't had time. So then he was helped to his feet, and he shuffled off like an old tortoise, shuffled off to the door, and Clemmy went with him, and then he put his hand to the door. And that evening he was giving a dinner to the entire cabinet, plus under ministers and secretaries of state and God knows who. 80 people, I believe, were involved that night. And he put his hand on the doorknob, and then just before opening it, he looked round, as it were, switched on once more, didn't look at me, but looked at his family and said, I'm going to have a bath. And then switched off again and shuffled away. And there he was. And I was subsequently told that, in point of fact, this was in his last year or so, when he was old, and he really shouldn't have been the Prime Minister, I think, really. Anyway, it was high time he did retire. On the other hand, when he was switched on, he was on. He couldn't switch on too frequently during the day, but when he was switched on, he was on. He was an extraordinary voice. Every time I ever saw him.
I was surprised to hear Hugh saying there that that was the only occasion he'd actually seen Winston Churchill in the flesh, as it were. But as he explained, as a small boy in North Wales, he had, through his parents, got to know Lloyd George well, a politician, Prime Minister, whom Churchill had regarded with veneration. And years ago, I recall reading somewhere that Lloyd George's secretary, Francis Stevenson, described Lloyd George saying, he had a magnetism which made my heart leap and swept aside my judgment. And I know so many people who'd say exactly the same thing of Sir Hugh Wheldon. But be that as it may, Hugh's influence on television in the early 60s was immense. He disliked waste of time, waste of talent. He despised mediocrity, for he regarded that as second rate. So what he did was this. He set about getting gifted people around him.
It fell to my lot to be asked to do a magazine program about the arts. We called it Monitor. And it was to go out once every 2 weeks. And that was an art equivalent of Panorama, the Sports View, and so on. And I became the editor and producer of this thing. And I did have an editorial policy. I didn't like to tell people what it was, but I was absolutely clear what it was. And the editorial policy was that nothing should be in the program, not ever, that I didn't approve of and like. And I don't know that it could have been called a celebratory program exactly, but by and large, what we went for were things that I was myself interested in. And it ran for 8 years. By the time 8 years had finished, I was worn out, and there was nothing else I was interested in. I'd finished it, so to speak. I enjoyed the program. And again, it was once more, it was truly a force of all arms. And I was encouraged and allowed. The BBC was a marvellous organisation in those days. Mind you, we were growing. It was a useful period. You see, we were lucky. And I was encouraged to get people from here and there and to find people, which I did. And so that during our run, we had good people working there permanently. John Schlesinger, who later went to Hollywood. He handled our film side, and Ken Russell, who also later went to Hollywood. He handled lots of our films as well. Humphrey Burton, who later went to all kinds of great positions. He was a production assistant. He was there throughout. David Jones was another, who then went to the Royal Shakespeare Company and then became a film director. Did the Harold Pinter films, Betrayal and all those things. Patrick Garland, who took over Chichester, he was there. Melvyn Bragg was there. All those people. So that we had a reasonable gang of kind of people.
Do you have any problems about disciplining these youngsters, these young Turks, imposing the BBC disciplines upon them?
No, not really, you know, not really. Not in any definite sense, because, again, they admired the BBC because we were so close to the war. Even the younger ones admired the BBC. And they felt that they were lucky to be on this bandwagon. And the fact that they wanted to do new things and in some way initiate things was very, very agreeable. It wasn't the other way around. It didn't feel like discipline.
And in those days, was there much policy direction from above?
There was no policy direction whatsoever from above me, none, except one gigantic policy direction, which was this tremendous feeling that trust was being reposed in you, and they allowed you to get on with it. And for 8 years, I did not once, on one single occasion, did I have any suggestion at all that I should do things that I was not doing, or I should not do things that I was doing. And the feeling of freedom and trust and confidence was tremendous.
It was in the late 60s, when he was controller of programs, that he conceived what became known as the magnum opus concept. Now, it was exciting, it was revolutionary, a development in program making that was to elevate the BBC in the viewing eyes of the world, especially in the United States of America.
I myself am proud of the fact. Again, I'm not making too much of a claim. I was only one among many. But I am proud of the fact that I personally did articulate quite clearly the notion that we were now at a stage, by 1964, 5, 6, that sort of time, when it should be possible to get non-fiction works of real substance, the equivalent of books. I remember saying that had Darwin, Marx, and Freud been writing in 1965, at least one of them should have been on television, not simply as a celebrity, but at least one of them should have been writing something for television. Part of their writing should have been a television operation. Now then, when this was very much in mind, it so happened that Lord Clark, Kenneth Clark, became, as it were, available. Now, he was an extraordinary chap. He'd run the National Gallery as a young man, made director of the National Gallery when he was 26 or something, turned up the first day in a Rolls Royce to be its director. He was the son of a banana king from Scotland. A most erudite, extraordinary man. Quiet, but he knew the form all right. And when he finished being the director of the National Gallery, he became the first chairman of the IBA, ITA as it was originally called, the commercial operation. Took it on. He was a chairman of the Arts Council, he was an OM, he was everything. And he had done a lot of television. Now, he'd got two things going for him. A, he had done a lot of television. Colin Clark, his son, had directed him in lots of things for the commercial people. And B, he was a known authority on art. So I told Humphrey Burton, get on to him. Whatever happens, get him over here. So we had talks with Kay Clark. And he took it for granted that what we wanted were a series of programs, which were just a series of programs. And I didn't want that. I really wanted something, and I was quite clear about it, that was the equivalent of a book. Now, he'd written a great book called The Art of Landscape. He'd written another notable book called The Art of the Nude. I didn't know what he now ought to write. How should I know? But I wanted the equivalent of a book, and I knew I did. He made some suggestions, and I remember very well it was suggested that a man called Tony de Labinia should direct a big series about the Impressionists, and Kay Clark would write it, and then the theory was that Laurence Olivier would then, or Michael Redgrave, or some grandee voice, would read the narration. But this, I didn't want this. See, this, I knew that would just become some ordinary television documentary series and old stuff. What I wanted was for Kay Clark himself to be absolutely involved so that the thing was as good as a book would have been. And he did a series called Civilization, which was the equivalent of a big book that he might have written and got credit for. That notion of a magnum opus then kept going. And we did that Bronowski series called The Ascent of Man and the Alistair Cook thing about America and various others. And it was only another strand to add to plays and series and classic serials and Shakespeare's and, I don't know, Miss World and everything else that we did. But it was an important strand, and all the time we kept to that notion that it had to be the equivalent of a true big work, not just some odds and ends of thoughts. And to do that, you always had to have these three things clear, plus a circumstance. The three things were, you always had to have a man who was an established authority. Bronowski was a scientist, a real scientist. He ran the Salk Institute at one time, and he was in a position to be an authority. Secondly, he had to be free for at least 2, perhaps 2.5 years, and be in a position to take an exclusive contract. And thirdly, he had to be somebody who knew television up and down. And the three weren't as easy to find. Bronowski was one. Alistair Cook was one. He'd been in and out of television for years, omnibus. He certainly knew what he was talking about. Alistair Cook's America. He didn't know America. He'd born and bred in Blackpool. And then fell in love with America, didn't he? Fell in love with the place. And so he was an authority as well as being a television man, and he just retired, and so he had 2 years to spare. So it was that notion that made these possible. Now, the circumstance that you needed to uphold that notion was to have an outfit that was confident enough to have confidence in those people, to have no script committees, no question of reference of any kind. All that was required, once the budget was agreed, and the budget was substantial, 1.25 million it was, I remember, for the America series, then they were told, well, get on with it. And what the authorities, including me, expected was, in 2 years' time, a series. And you needed the tradition of a great publishing house for that to take place. And it spoke well for the corporation, I think, and I'm myself taking a certain pride of place in what I say, in the sense that I was the controller of programs at the time, and I certainly presided over that particular adventure. On the other hand, I couldn't conceivably have done so had it not been for the institution of the corporation that was accustomed to big ideas of this kind properly handled. And so the BBC was there, plus the circumstances of the day.
And he himself was a man who stimulated program ideas. As a presenter of programs like All Your Own and Monitor and Royal Heritage, he was much admired. As a producer of distinguished programs, he set enviable standards. But after many years in production and 3 as controller of programs, in 1968, Hugh Wheldon became the managing director of BBC Television. Now, few people have all the qualities, but Hugh had the vocabulary and the confidence, the knowledge, the presence of a performer, the invention of a producer, and the vision of an administrator. Michael Parkinson wondered if, on moving into senior management, he'd missed working in the climate of what some people call the creative side of television.
I didn't find it actually very different, being the producer of a program and being the director of programs. I didn't find it all that different, being the editor of Monitor and being the managing director. That is to say, both jobs seem to me to require everything you can bring to them. And I don't think that there is something, as it were, special about what is called the creative process. In fact, I don't actually think much of the word creative, to be perfectly honest, seeing that we're on it. I mean, in the Old Testament, only God creates, you know. I mean, I haven't looked up Prudence Concordance, and I don't know if it's actually true of the entire Old Testament. But on the whole, when the word create is used, it's used with reference to God, because he makes something out of nothing. And out of nothing, something, that's creation. All the rest is making. I mean, it's like Paul Daniel. I mean, what he does is a marvelous man, I thought he was. Anyway, everybody else makes things. And it seems to me that provided that the job you have is complex and not laborious and simple and very laborious, then it draws on what you can provide for it and provide into it. And the process, you see, it's an extraordinary thing to say, but the process of making a budget for this place, which runs into millions and millions of pounds, the actual process of making that budget is not so different from the actual process of making a program. The same elements of priority and what you're really after and what is really important and what the priorities are, the same element of suspense, the same element of one thing can be done tomorrow, another thing will take 6 years to make. The same processes of discrimination and distinction, and certainly the same nerve, the same courage, and as a matter of fact, the same kind of performance. I mean, I've often been asked whether I didn't miss performance. And as a matter of fact, I think you perform more when you're a managing director than when you're... I mean, you actually don't perform all that much. I mean, what you try to be is Michael Parkinson, isn't it? I mean, yes. By and large.
Yes, yes.
I mean, you're not acting all the time. Well, you're not, are you?
No.
You try, all you try to be is Michael. Now, if you were managing director, you would be trying to be more than Michael Parkinson. You would be trying to demonstrate to very, very strong-minded people that you knew more than them.
So you did more acting in
Yes. I mean, that's right, and I think that goes for all managing directors everywhere.
Really?
Yeah, well, that's what I think.
Yes.
And I really didn't find, I don't think that there is a distinction between the creative impulse, as it were. There are artists and there are obsessed persons. I mean, there are persons who really, through whom music flows, as with Mozart, as it were. It is not I, but music who speaks. And there are such people, they're special. And there are geniuses, and they're special. But they are very rare, and most of us are not among those. Most of us, I think, are makers of things, and whether we're managing directors or whether we make other things, that's what we are. And I distrust the word. As a matter of fact, when I was here, I distrusted people who called themselves creative artists. I always felt they had kind of illusions of divinity.
Well,
Hugh Wheldon certainly had a sense of the ridiculous, a sense of fun. He also had great charm. Some would say the ruthless charm of an inspired leader. Anyway, he was someone you desperately wanted to follow. He was disarmingly outspoken, appealing to the television gourmet and to the most junior production assistant or secretary. He was sympathetic, he was kind, and he inspired loyalty, for he made us all feel that he cared, which he certainly did. You know, the moment he came into a room, you were aware of his style. His presence was electric. You felt the BBC was in good hands. Now, as managing director, Sir Hugh Wheldon was responsible not only for the well-being of the staff, finance and resources, and standards of performance and production, but for forming many of the program policies. The BBC has long been respected throughout the world, especially in the United States, where television is predominantly commercial. But the Americans have always been sort of perplexed, really, by the way the BBC actually operates. In 1975, Hugh Wheldon explained to Bill Moyes, an American correspondent, the intricacies of the BBC system.
What do you do now? Do you say, this is what is good and this is what the people ought to see?
Oh, no, my dear chap. Oh, no. I mean, you must, oh, no. There is a question, the answer to which in broadcasting in this country is taboo, and it's not less than taboo. I mean, it's much more taboo than incest. It really is taboo.
I'm leaving town right after
And the question is this: do you give them what they want, or do you give them what they ought to have? Now, it's a taboo question because there is no answer to that question. I mean, if you'd said that question to Shakespeare, or to P.G. Wodehouse, or to George Eliot, or to Raymond Chandler, in fact, to anybody who makes things, what would his answer be? Neither. I am giving them neither what they want, nor what I think they ought to have. What Shakespeare and P.G. Wodehouse and Raymond Chandler and Updike and Mailer and anybody gives people is what they can make a living by, and something which will gain them the admiration of people whose judgment they admire. And you finesse the question. Under no circumstances did Shakespeare say to himself, writing Twelfth Night, now then, is this what they want? Or, now, is this what they ought to have? Not at all. What he did was to write as good a play as he possibly could, which he thought he'd also make a living by, make enough to keep himself going and allow him to write another one. That's what he did. And what's good enough for him is good enough for us.
No one sits around the table and says, we ought to do historical drama, or we ought to do scientific...
Well, they do, because there's money in it, you see. It takes a lot of money, so there's a lot of sitting around tables. Getting the money is the business. It's nearly always obsession, isn't it, in the end? It's obsession, preoccupation. Forsyte Saga, it was a fellow called Donald Wilson, Highlander, with hair coming out of his cheekbones, you know, well, tall. He was obsessed with the Forsyte Saga, and he just thought that it would go very well. MGM had the rights, and we couldn't get the rights for ages. MGM wouldn't sell them, and that made him all the more obsessed. And in the end, he went to work on the Forsyte Saga and found that you couldn't do it unless you wrote a new part one. Wrote a new part one all by himself. Nobody knew, you know, but he did. And then he drove and drove and drove to get it on the air. I mean, he was a producer. He was the head of serials at that time. It cost a lot of money to make, but in the end, he succeeded. Once he got his money, he just went on then.
I always wondered if, was it just very good soap opera, or was it more?
No, I think soap opera, you see, I mean, you give a dog a bad name and you hang it. I think soap opera. We won't, that's another taboo. I won't allow the word soap opera to be mentioned in BBC television. And if anybody goes so far as to say, well, now, this might make a good soap opera, as far as I'm concerned, that's finished. And we don't start, because you're giving it a bad name. The word soap opera suggests that it's manufactured. No program should be manufactured, only made. And the Forsyte Saga was certainly made.
What do you mean by that? The difference between manufacturing and making?
Well, to manufacture a program is to take a formula, a kind of easy way in which you can make quick tricks, which you can do it quite quickly, without too much rehearsal, without too much work. You rest on the formulation and on the formula. That is what a soap opera is, fundamentally, and you turn it out. That's the expression, turn it out. You manufacture it. Now, I don't believe any television program, under any circumstances, should ever be turned out. All television programs should be made, either with writers and directors working together, or with contributors and directors working together. All programs should be made and never turned out.
Does the government put pressure on you?
Not the government, not at all.
I was here in 1971 when there was a small storm in Parliament because the BBC was showing extremism in Northern Ireland. And there were complaints that you were, in effect, promoting violence. Not intentionally, but consequentially. And for a while...
Yes, there was a row. There was a row.
For a while, you didn't put on IRA leaders.
But we've always been very careful about IRA leaders. We've allowed, naturally, you've got to cover what's happening there. You see, it's a very complicated process, covering what's happening in your own country, where you've got civil disturbance. Now, then, the IRA, of course, are from another country. I mean, they're from the Republic. And we've always been very careful. We've only had 3 IRA men on throughout, anyway, as IRA people. The row wasn't so much about that. The row was about dealing with the thing in as big a way as we were doing. Now, there was one government. There was one moment, and probably the moment you were thinking of, when the government, in the presence of Mr. Maudling, who had just come back as Foreign Secretary, Mr. Maudling was Home Secretary at that time, and Mr. Maudling asked us not to do a programme we were thinking of doing, which was a big debate with Paisley and everybody in it, about Ulster. And we'd got all the main people, you know, to be in this debate, and it was going to last 2 or 3 hours. We got Mr. Justice Devlin and all sorts of people. It was a very well thought-out programme, we thought. Anyway, Mr. Maudling got very bothered about this and felt that it would harm things, and he did ask us publicly. He wrote us a letter asking us not to put it on. And so we had to take it very seriously, and it went to the Board of Governors. I mean, the BBC, like anything else, has got a Board of Governors, you know. And so they thought about it, and in the end they decided, well, they would put it on, because they thought it was a perfectly proper programme to put on. So we did put it on, and there was a row. You know, these rows happen.
In 1956, if I remember correctly, when commercial television arrived in Britain, BBC lost a large portion of its audience.
Yes,
people were
they went over there.
So,
that's right. They said, here we go, boys, and at last we can go and look at commercial television. And they did. And for a time, they were looking at commercial television in the relationship of 70 to 30. I mean, 70% of the audience was with the commercial competitor, and only 30% was with us. It was intolerable.
what happened, do you think? Why?
We naturally put that right.
Are they back?
Well, of course.
How did you get them back?
Well, we got them back in 2 ways. We naturally got very bothered because if our audience had gone down much more, down to 20, and of course once you go down it's like a falling circulation, isn't it? I mean, the inherent dynamic of a falling circulation is downwards. I mean, from him that taketh away, from him that hath not is taken away even that which he hath. And if you're on 30% this week, you're going to be on 29 next week.
And everything that goes down doesn't necessarily come up.
That's right, it doesn't. So we were quite bothered. Secondly, of course, this was going to do a great disservice to a great institution. I mean, the BBC is not some little sectional institution. I mean, it's a great institution of the Western world, but it's not going to be kind of 20% of the audience. So we had to do something. Well, in the final analysis, it wasn't very difficult, really. We set about a little bit of rescheduling. We found, it's one of these ridiculous stories, we found that if you could get a very big part of the audience going with you around about 6:30, 7 o'clock and 7:30 in the evening, that they were likely to remain with you for the rest of the evening, come what may. I mean, we found, in other words, that our commercial competitors were putting on very popular programs at 6:30 and 7 and 7:30. So we thought, well, now then we better knock them in the eye. That's the obvious thing to do. And we are quite capable of making popular programs. And the great thing to do was to make these popular programs and put them opposite those and beat them at it, you see. So we decided the thing to do was to put on light entertainment, a situation comedy, which the BBC has always been marvellous at, and to put on all this situation comedy early in the evening, 6:30, and knock them back. Now, we were up against it because of course, the comedians and the actors didn't like that at all. I mean, they know for certain where they should go. They should go after a very popular program, so they inherit that amount of audience, and be opposite a documentary on balsam in Chile. I mean, they know. So they didn't want to go in 6:30 or 7. However, we had to twist their arms and make them bleed and all the rest of it. And in the end, they played ball, and so we put very popular programs in at 6:30 and 7 o'clock, Monday through Friday, and within 3 months, we had them back.
Played the game.
Of course. I mean, if a Tory government in its infinite wisdom decided to put up a commercial competitor to compete against us, they could hardly expect us not to compete back, could they?
Let's look back to the plaque that's on the entrance hall of Broadcast House in London.
Broadcasting House.
Broadcasting House. And it reads as follows.
You got it in English or in Latin?
I've got it in English, of course. This temple of the arts and muses is dedicated to Almighty God by the first governors in the year of our Lord, 1931, John Reith being Director General. And they pray that the good seed sown may bring forth good harvests, that all things foul or hostile to peace may be banished hence, and that the people, inclining their ear to whatsoever things are lovely and honest, whatsoever things are of good report, may tread the path of virtue and of wisdom. Good statement of the spirit of 1931. Do you think television is fulfilled? Do you think the BBC has fulfilled what the first board of governors hoped it would? and has it in a way made the man in the pub tread the path of virtue and of wisdom?
Well, you see, when you use phrases like tread the path of virtue and wisdom, they are rather condescending kind of phrases, and they're difficult for us to live with. They're like Matthew Arnold's great phrase about sweetness and light. It was a marvelous essay he wrote, but sweetness and light came into it, and somehow it's difficult to live with. On the other hand, I don't think that we're as far away from that as a sardonic view might think. In the 30s, our country was much more patrician, it was much more establishment-minded, and it was still imperial, of course. So that kind of statement was more possible. By today, we're not imperial. The establishment is virtually national, as it were. It's very democratic in that sense. And so we've got a different pulse beating in the national heart. On the other hand, given all that, what programs should be is truthful in their different ways. If a program is funny, well, then it should be a good program, which is funny. And it should be a funny program that is good. And if it's a serious program, well, then it should be truthful in its own serious way. And I do not believe that it is entirely... It's not sense to dismiss big words like truth and beauty. In the end, you can't. I mean, if you do, I don't mean you, but nobody can. In the end, I mean, the question is, are those programs good? I mean, was that first one really as funny as they said it was? Was that second one as documentary, in a documentary sense, as meaningful as they said it was? Was it not true that the first was really commonplace and vulgar and predictable? And was it not true that the second one was really very biased, and what it was really saying was, why aren't you more like me? Which is what an awful lot of documentary programs do say. Is it really true that news was well judged, and was it as accurate as it could have been? And was it true in the end that that play that was commissioned with such a rage of trumpets wasn't really cheating itself, cheating its own author, cheating the public, cheating everybody by, in the end, cutting corners? I mean, were the programs as good as they were said to have been? Now, it is possible for them to be, and if programs are as good as that, well, then you are, as a matter of fact, the best you can, living up to that kind of tradition. And that's what the inheritance allows you at least to try to do. And all we do, of course, I regret everything, is fail at it all the time, but at least that's what you can try.